Now, we return to Anambra State governorship polls as the Center for Democracy and Development in a report states that the latent public support for non-state actors like IPOB, the indigenous people of Biafra, heavy deployment of security forces and acrimonious political competition will lead to a depressing voter turnout that will be more than previous polls in the state. In the report, the CDD also states that high voter abstention rates mean that election malpractice such as vote buying or rigging, which have proven impossible to eradicate in Nigeria elections, will have a dramatic impact on the final outcome. It concludes that low voter turnout risks weakening the mandate of Anambra's next governor, given the likelihood that he or she will be elected by only a fraction of the entire voting population.
Well, Saeed Husaini, the Director of Research at the Center for Democracy and Development, he joins us now for more on that particular report or that story we just told. Glad to have you join us in the studio, Saeed.
Thanks for having me.
Now, let's start this way with the proscribed IPOB. There's this question of there will be no, well, people should sit at home between the 5th and the 10th. There's the question of security in Anambra State. There's the question of killings in Anambra State. What I want to find out from you is, what will be the impact on voter turnout with these indices that I have pointed out?
I mean, firstly, it's worth noting that these very unfortunate developments have already had an impact on electioneering. So we've seen that parties have been less exuberant in their campaigning, certainly. We've seen also that there have been delays and obstacles in the way of the electoral umpire, INEC, in conducting its own duties in the lead up to the election. So we expect that we'll see similar sorts of obstacles emerge on election day as well, because of course voters would have been paying attention to the news stories, they would have been paying attention to happenings in their own environments. So they're unlikely to go out in a context that is marked by increased tension, where there are exceeding reports of violent incidences of various sorts. So this is why we've said in the report you were citing that there's every likelihood of actually very low levels of voter turnout, which will in a way be a continuation of an existing trend whereby voter turnout has historically been quite low in the state, but we expect this unfortunately to be even lower than usual.
So are there hotspots? Give us a summary of this, your report. Are these implications around the 21 local governments where the elections are going to hold, or are there hotspots where we're likely to see this more prevalent? And have you shared these concerns with other authorities such as the security agencies, the electoral umpire, the political parties themselves?
Well, our report sought to consider the wider political context, factoring in security. So it wasn't primarily, it wasn't solely based on security, but of course that is the most significant concern as we approach this election. So it goes without saying that the security challenge is not uniform across the state. And in terms of the specific attacks we've witnessed, they've tended to target police, security institutions, or other institutions of state.
IPOB institutions as well.
Well,
sorry. INEC, I wanted to say INEC.
So for instance, in May, there was the attack in Oka on the INEC branch, which led to the loss of equipment, and actually destruction of some parts of the building. So there have certainly been, pockets of these attacks, and we've even seen more recent ones, unfortunately, much more recently. But yes, of course, there's, as I'm sure we'll talk further about, quite a heavy deployment now of the police in the state. And INEC has tried to reassure voters that it is in fact ready, and despite the attack you're referencing on their offices, they've made an attempt to reassure voters that they have in fact recovered from those attacks. So it appears from our standpoint that the election will hold, but whether or not voters have the confidence to go out and cast their ballot is where the big question lies.
All right, we'll talk more about security and what the president said, but let's delve into the elections proper, into the day, November 6th. Do you see the elections proper on that day being influenced in any form if there is low turnout of voters, in any form at all?
Yeah, unfortunately, what we've seen in elections in the past, and this is a worldwide situation, is that in contexts where voter turnouts are very low, the impact of electoral malpractices are multiplied. So, if a large number of people actually come out and cast their ballots credibly, it will mean that irregularities or malpractices have a proportionally smaller influence on the overall outcome. But unfortunately, where it's much less people, as I've said, then any single irregularity has that larger potential of influencing the ultimate outcome.
But with the technology, do you think that would really be the case? The technology INEC is supposed to employ?
Well, I'm happy you bring that up, and this is one of the kind of encouraging aspects of this election, is the fact that INEC has in fact put in place some new innovations to help strengthen the credibility of this election. One in particular is the BVAS, the bimodal voter accreditation system, which is supposed to use two methods, bimodal, both the facial recognition and fingerprint, to accredit voters. So that's laudable, but will that resolve the wide spectrum of potential irregularities that might emerge? Some emerge before accreditation, some emerge after. So that does play a role, but of course it can't resolve the entirety of the spectrum of irregularities that might emerge.
Indeed. What the Anambra people would not want is an unpopular governor or a governor of the few, and so they need to come out. But we'll talk about heavy presence of security arriving in the state. Over 34,000 policemen and more senior security police officers, DIGs, AIGs are going to be in the state. But we've seen election in the past, and you have been monitoring elections in Nigeria. Do those heavy police presence or security presence translate to better confidence in the poll for the people to actually come out to vote? And what exactly do you think we need to be doing? What needs to be done? We're barely 4 or 5 days into this election. What should be done, and by who?
That's a series of very fair questions. I think the first one you pose about the influence or the impact of security agencies is a very important one. Of course, in a context of conflict, there is a need to provide security and to provide the sort of visible presence of security forces so you understand where they're coming from. But at the same time, of course, it sends the wrong kind of message about what is at play here. This is supposed to be the free exercise of people's democratic franchise, rather than one that's heavily policed or securitized. So yes, I mean, this is one of the factors that we've considered in thinking through how this election is likely to play out, that we foresee will likely also drive down voter turnout, because frankly, people are less likely to go out if they see guns or if they see armored vehicles or if they sense a tense environment. Now, in terms of what can be done or what is necessary at this point, of course, we are quite close now to the election. So I think part of the messaging that we've called on the media and civil society groups and think tanks like ours to continue to promote is one of peace, right? Is that to the extent that citizens can actually control what happens, they can certainly control what they do and how they act at the polls. So we would urge that citizens consider and continue to exercise their democratic franchise, but within a context of peace, within a context of continuing to uphold that seemingly fragile security that exists in the state.
Well, I'm still going to take care of all the presence of the security agencies. Maybe a two-edged sword, if you want to say, but the president has clearly said that the security agencies, officers, should use unusual force, if need be, to make sure that the elections are held in Anambra. He said nothing must stop the holding of elections. Isn't that a confidence booster? Shouldn't it be?
Well, like I say, it is a mixed bag because I think the context in which people would feel most confidence is one that didn't require the heavy deployment of security forces. So it goes without saying that these are not optimal circumstances. But yet we still feel that the presence of security forces, to the extent that they can uphold to best practice in terms of human rights and how they treat voters, can make some contribution to making sure that the polls are secured and that voters are able to exercise their franchise.
All right, thank you so much, Saeed Husaini of the CDD, for being here.
Thank you very much for having me.
All right.